It was just an ordinary Thursday afternoon when Sarah Turner, a young black teacher, stepped into the downtown mall to pick up a birthday gift for her niece. She had just finished a long day at school, where she taught fifth graders the importance of kindness and respect. Little did she know, her day was about to take a shocking turn that would not only test her resilience but spark a movement no one could have foreseen. As Sarah strolled past a high-end jewelry store, she noticed a commotion inside. A security guard, tall and imposing, was glaring in her direction. Before she could piece together what was happening, he stormed out of the store, his voice cutting through the mall's usual hum of shoppers. "Ma'am, I need to see your bag," he demanded loudly, his tone sharp and condescending. Sarah froze, confusion flashing across her face. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "You were just in the store, weren't you?" the guard barked. "We got a report of suspicious activity." Sarah's heart sank as she realized what this was. "I haven't stepped foot in your store," she replied, trying to steady her voice. "You got the wrong person." But the guard wasn't listening. He grabbed for her bag, his movements rough, as onlookers stopped and stared. Embarrassment and anger rose in Sarah's chest. She had worked hard her whole life to carry herself with dignity. And now she was being humiliated in public, accused of something she didn't do, all because of the color of her skin. The next 7 minutes were a blur of humiliation, heated accusations, and denial of basic respect. By the end of it, Sarah had not only been forced to empty her bag on the floor in front of strangers but was also threatened with being banned from the mall. What happened next, however, shocked everyone and set off a chain of events that would change her life. And the lives of many others. Forever. Stay with me, because this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive into what happened next, comment below and let us know your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed or experienced something like this? And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. It was a gray Monday morning in Redford, Virginia, the kind of small town where people wore familiarity like a second skin. The world moved slowly here, caught somewhere between nostalgia and inertia. For Thomas Jenkins, a black man in his mid-40s, the pace was both a comfort and a reminder. A comfort because the quiet streets and well-worn faces made the town feel like home. A reminder because here, things seldom change. Thomas owned the only barbershop on Maple Avenue, a space that had become a meeting place for stories, debates, and the unspoken tension that underpinned the town. The shop was small, with vintage chairs that squeaked when turned, walls decorated with faded posters of old jazz legends, and the faint scent of aftershave lingering in the air. For Thomas, this was more than a business. It was a refuge, a place where he could be both himself and part of something larger. The morning had begun like any other. Thomas stood by the window, sipping his coffee as the town came alive. The hardware store owner across the street was rolling up his shutters. Mrs. Whitaker from the bakery was arranging her window display. Everything seemed just as it always had, until the sound of raised voices outside drew his attention. Through the glass, he saw two men standing on the curb. A black teenager, lanky and visibly nervous, and an older white man in a sheriff's uniform. The boy was clutching a backpack, his body tense as the sheriff gestured toward him, his tone sharp enough to cut through the quiet morning air. Thomas frowned, setting his coffee down. He stepped outside, the brisk air biting at his skin as he approached the scene. "Morning, Sheriff Grady," Thomas said, his voice steady but polite. He turned to the boy. "Everything all right here?" Grady looked up, his expression shifting from irritation to guardedness. "Morning, Jenkins. Just handling a little situation here. Young man says he's passing through, but he's got no ID on him." The boy's eyes darted to Thomas, a flicker of hope flashing across his face. "I wasn't doing nothing," he said quickly, his voice cracking. "Just walking to the bus stop." Thomas nodded slowly, his gaze moving between Grady and the boy. "Doesn't sound like a crime to me. Do you need a witness or something?" Grady's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the air seemed to hum with unspoken words. Finally, the sheriff sighed. "Just doing my job, Jenkins, making sure everything's on the up and up." Thomas said nothing, but the weight of the exchange lingered as the sheriff muttered something about moving along, and stepped back to his patrol car. The boy looked at Thomas. Gratitude and fear etched across his face. "Thank you, sir," he murmured before hurrying off down the street. Back in the barber shop, Thomas couldn't shake the interaction. It wasn't the first time he'd seen Grady act this way. Selective enforcement, as some in the community called it. The sheriff was careful to frame his actions as keeping the peace. But Thomas knew better. It was a peace that came with conditions. One that demanded silence in the face of subtle indignities. As the morning unfolded, customers trickled into the shop, bringing their own stories and speculations. Mr. Langston, a retired teacher, shook his head as he recounted how his grandson had been followed around the local grocery store last week. Marjorie Simmons, the town's unofficial historian, shared how a black family from the next county had been denied a loan for a house on the edge of town. Funny how those kinds of things never seem to happen to the folks over on the west side, she said, her voice heavy with irony. Thomas listened, his hands steady as he trimmed and shaved. But his thoughts churned beneath the surface. Redford prided itself on being a town where everyone knew their neighbors. Where the past was preserved like a cherished heirloom. But that past had its shadows. And they were impossible to ignore. The day wore on, the rhythm of the shop punctuated by the hum of clippers and the laughter of customers. Yet, beneath the camaraderie, there was an undercurrent of unease. Thomas could feel it in the way people glanced toward the window when a patrol car drove by. In the subtle pauses that crept into conversations when certain topics came up. By the time the sun began to set, painting the town in hues of gold and amber, Thomas stood alone in the shop, cleaning his tools. The day had left him restless, a familiar ache stirring in his chest. He thought about the boy from that morning, about the way his shoulders had hunched as if bracing for something worse. He thought about Sheriff Grady, whose polite words always carried an edge. Thomas exhaled, his breath fogging the glass as he looked out onto the quiet street. Redford was a town of contradictions, a place that claimed to value unity but struggled to see beyond its divisions. And as much as Thomas loved his home, he couldn't ignore the cracks in its foundation. He locked the door and turned off the lights, the hum of the town settling into its nighttime quiet. But for Thomas, the day's events were far from over. They lingered in his mind like a melody that refused to resolve. A reminder that some battles were fought not in grand gestures but in the quiet, everyday moments where choices were made and lines were drawn. The morning light filtered through the blinds of Thomas Jenkins' barbershop, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. The hum of the town was already alive outside, with its familiar rhythm of hurried steps and distant conversations. Inside, the shop buzzed softly, an oasis of ritual and routine. Thomas sharpened his scissors as his first customer, Reverend Elijah Marks, settled into the chair. "Busy morning, Reverend?" Thomas asked, his tone casual but warm. "Busy as ever," Elijah replied, adjusting his clerical collar. "You know how it is. Trying to keep the flock together. People need a little extra hope these days." Thomas nodded, his mind lingering on the Reverend's words. It had been a strange week in Redford. One marked by subtle shifts in the town's usual atmosphere. Small things. A cashier's too long stare at a black teenager paying with crumpled bills. Hushed whispers in the grocery store when a new family moved into the East Side apartments. It wasn't outright hostility, but it was there, simmering beneath the surface, like cracks spreading under the weight of something unspoken. As the day wore on, the shop filled with its usual blend of personalities. Marjorie Simmons with her sharp tongue and sharper observations. Earl Henson sharing his exaggerated fishing tales. And Daniel, a young schoolteacher who always came in with a book tucked under his arm. Each brought their stories, their complaints, their laughter. But as the conversations drifted from the mundane to the meaningful, a recurring tension began to emerge. "Did you hear about the library board meeting last night?" Marjorie asked, her voice carrying the weight of indignation. "They're talking about removing a whole section of books because some parents don't like what they teach about history." "Which parents?" Earl asked, though his tone made the answer obvious. Marjorie's lips thinned. "The ones who think their version of history is the only one that matters." Thomas felt his grip on the clippers tighten. Conversations like this have become more common in Redford lately. The town prided itself on being a place where people got along. But that harmony always seemed to hinge on unspoken rules. Rules that dictated what could be said, where one could go, and how much space a person was allowed to occupy before it became too much. Around midday, the door jingled open, and in walked a woman Thomas hadn't seen before. She was middle-aged, with a sharpness in her eyes that suggested she missed very little. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight bun, and she carried herself with an air of quiet authority. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice smooth but firm. "I'm Eleanor Reeves. Just moved here with my family." Thomas greeted her with his usual warmth, offering her a seat in the waiting area. The other customers acknowledged her politely, but there was a stiffness in the air, a hesitation that Thomas recognized all too well. Eleanor, for all her poise, was a stranger, a black woman stepping into a town where newcomers were met with curiosity at best, suspicion at worst. As she waited, Eleanor struck up a conversation with Daniel, the schoolteacher. Their exchange began light, but it quickly turned weighty as she mentioned her youngest son's experience at school. "He came home yesterday," Eleanor said, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. "Told me a boy in his class asked him why his family lived here when they could go back to where they came from." The shop fell quiet, the air thick with unspoken reactions. Daniel looked uncomfortable, his fingers fidgeting with the book in his lap. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said softly. "Kids can be cruel, but it's usually just ignorance, not malice." Eleanor's expression didn't waver. "Ignorance can be just as dangerous, don't you think? Especially when it's learned at home." Later that evening, Thomas found himself walking the quiet streets of Redford. The conversation in the shop had stayed with him, as had Eleanor's calm but piercing words. He passed the diner, where the glow of neon lights reflected off the windows, and the library, where a notice board displayed the schedule for the next town meeting. At each stop, he saw the ways the town's past seeped into its present, the plaques commemorating heroes whose stories left out uncomfortable truths, the well-tended lawns on one side of town and the cracked sidewalks on the other. When he returned home, the television flickered in the background as he sat at his kitchen table. His mind restless, he thought about the boy from the other morning, about Eleanor's son, about the Reverend's words. These weren't isolated incidents, they were threads in a larger tapestry, one that stretched far beyond Redford. Thomas pulled out a notebook, the pages blank but full of possibility. He had always believed in the power of dialogue, in the importance of holding space for stories that others might overlook. Perhaps it was time to start something new, a space where the town could confront its contradictions, where those who felt unseen could share their truths. He began to write, the pen moving steadily across the page. The words came slowly at first, but soon they flowed, a quiet but insistent rhythm. Thomas didn't know where this path would lead, but he knew one thing for certain: the cracks beneath the surface couldn't be ignored forever. Redford's town square bustled on a breezy Saturday morning, the faint smell of fried dough and the sound of children's laughter mixing with the hum of conversation. The farmer's market was in full swing, and Thomas Jenkins wandered between stalls, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. On the surface, everything appeared harmonious, neighbors exchanging smiles, vendors cheerfully advertising their produce. But Thomas knew better. Beneath the easy chatter lay a tension, subtle yet persistent, like the faint rumble of thunder in the distance. As he approached a stand selling homemade preserves, Thomas spotted Eleanor Reeves at a nearby stall, chatting with an older white woman. Eleanor's easy smile masked her sharp awareness, and Thomas could see her measuring the woman's words even as she laughed politely. The dynamic was familiar, a dance of cautious diplomacy often required of newcomers in a town like Redford. "Morning, Thomas," called a voice from behind. He turned to see Marjorie Simmons, her arms full of canvas bags and her expression full of purpose. "Morning, Marjorie. Are you stocking up for the week?" "Trying to," she said with a huff. "But it's hard to focus with all the talk floating around. Did you hear about the petition?" "Petition?" Marjorie leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Some folks want to move the new families out of the East Side apartments. They're saying it's about preserving property values, but we both know what that really means." Thomas's stomach tightened. The apartments had always been a source of quiet contention in Redford, seen by some as a lowering of the town's standards. The arrival of new black families had only heightened the whispers. The tension escalated that afternoon during a town meeting at the library. Thomas had decided to attend after hearing about the petition, though he wasn't sure what he hoped to accomplish. The meeting room was packed, with rows of folding chairs filled and people standing against the walls. Sheriff Grady was there, leaning casually in the back, his presence a reminder of the town's power dynamics. At the front of the room, a man named Frank Wells was speaking. Frank, a local business owner with a booming voice and a polished demeanor, was one of the petition's main proponents. "We're not trying to single anyone out," Frank insisted, his tone measured. "This is about maintaining the character of our town. Redford's always been a safe, tight-knit community, and we want to keep it that way." Thomas felt the words coil around the room. Subtle but barbed. Safe, tight-knit, character. Each phrase carried an unspoken meaning, one that everyone in the room understood but no one would say outright. Eleanor Reeves stood up, her calm presence commanding attention. "Mr. Wells," she began, her voice steady, "I'd like to understand what you mean by character. Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're talking about keeping people like me out." A murmur rippled through the room, and Frank's composure faltered for a moment. "That's not what I'm saying," he replied quickly. "We just don't want any disruptions. We've all worked hard to build this community, and we don't want to see it change for the worse." "For the worse," Eleanor repeated, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "And what exactly is worse? New faces? Different perspectives? Or is it just the color of our skin?" The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. Thomas watched as Frank shifted uncomfortably, his polished facade cracking. "I think we all need to stay civil here," Frank said, his tone tight. "No need to make this personal." Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. "It's already personal, Mr. Wells. It's personal every time someone looks at my son like he doesn't belong. Every time we're reminded that we're newcomers in a place that's only welcoming as long as we stay quiet." After the meeting, Thomas lingered in the parking lot, his thoughts racing. He admired Eleanor's courage, but he also saw how her words had been met with silence from most of the room. People weren't ready to confront the truth, and the cracks in Redford's unity were growing wider. "Thomas," came a voice from behind. He turned to see Eleanor approaching, her expression a mixture of determination and exhaustion. "You held your ground in there," Thomas said, his voice warm with respect. Eleanor exhaled, her breath visible in the chilly air. "I've had practice, but I'm not naive. People like Frank don't change their minds because of a few words in a meeting." "No," Thomas agreed, "but sometimes words plant seeds." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "And sometimes you need more than words. You need action." Thomas thought about her statement long after they parted ways. Eleanor was right. Words could only do so much. He had spent years building a place for dialogue in his barbershop. But maybe it was time to step beyond those walls. Redford didn't just need conversations, it needed change. That evening, Thomas sat at his kitchen table with his notebook, the events of the day replaying in his mind. The meeting had made one thing clear: the cracks in Redford's surface wouldn't close on their own. If the town was going to confront its contradictions, someone had to lead the way. He began to write, his pen moving across the page with purpose. The words came slowly at first, but they gathered strength, each line a step towards something bigger. Thomas didn't know exactly where this path would lead, but he knew one thing: Redford's story wasn't finished, and neither was his. The early light of dawn filtered through the blinds in Thomas Jenkins's small living room. He sat at the edge of his worn couch, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. His notebook, its pages now filled with notes and ideas, lay open on the coffee table. He had spent most of the night writing, refining his thoughts, and trying to find the right words to spark something bigger than just dialogue. Redford needed more than quiet complaints murmured among trusted friends. It needed a movement. By mid-morning, Thomas found himself in the town square, a clipboard tucked under his arm. He had printed copies of a letter he had written, an open call for unity, for rejecting the petition, and for building a Redford that welcomed everyone. The letter was firm but hopeful, meant to appeal to the better nature of the townspeople. As he approached the first group of neighbors, he felt his pulse quicken. These were people he had known for years, regulars at the barbershop, folks who often greeted him with warm smiles. But this conversation felt different, heavier. "Morning, Thomas," said Harold, a retired postal worker with a stoic demeanor. "What's that you've got there?" "It's a letter," Thomas began, keeping his tone calm but purposeful. "I'm asking folks to stand against that petition and support the new families in town. It's not right to push people out just because they look different or live differently." Harold's brow furrowed. I don't have a problem with anyone. But you have to admit, things feel different lately. Some folks are just worried about keeping the peace. The peace? Thomas asked, his voice soft but steady. Peace isn't about keeping quiet while others are pushed out. It's about fairness, Harold. It's about everyone feeling like they belong. Harold hesitated, his eyes searching Thomas's face. I'll think about it, he muttered, before walking away. It wasn't the enthusiastic response Thomas had hoped for. But it wasn't outright rejection either. He moved on, stopping to speak with small groups and individuals, repeating his message with each encounter. Some nodded in quiet agreement. Others looked uncomfortable, and a few dismissed him outright. By noon, Thomas stopped at a food truck parked near the square for a quick bite. As he ate, he noticed Eleanor Reeves approaching, a determined look on her face. "You've been busy," she said, gesturing to the clipboard. "Trying to be," Thomas replied, "but I'm not sure how much good it's doing." Eleanor gave him a small smile. "You planted seeds. Sometimes that's all you can do." She reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of flyers. "I've been working on these," she said, handing him one. The flyer announced a community forum to discuss the petition, with space for public comment and open discussion. "I figured if they can gather people to push us out, we can gather people to push back." Thomas studied the flyer, impressed. "This is good, real good. I'll need help spreading the word," Eleanor said, her tone matter of fact. "You got it," Thomas replied without hesitation. The forum was scheduled for the following week, and Thomas spent the days leading up to it working tirelessly with Eleanor and a few other allies. They went door to door, posted flyers on community boards, and shared the event with everyone who would listen. The response was mixed, but a noticeable shift began to emerge. People who had remained silent before started asking questions, expressing tentative support, or at least curiosity. On the night of the forum, the library meeting room was packed. Folding chairs filled the space, and more people stood along the walls, their faces a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. Thomas and Eleanor stood at the front, flanked by a small panel of speakers from the community. Eleanor began with a brief speech, her voice clear and unwavering. "This isn't just about a petition," she said. "It's about what kind of town we want Redford to be. Are we a community that values fairness and inclusion, or one that hides behind excuses to keep people out?" Thomas followed, sharing stories from his years in the barbershop, where he had heard firsthand the struggles of those who felt unwelcome in their own town. He spoke not with anger, but with a quiet resolve, weaving his words with the same care he used when crafting letters late at night. As the forum opened for public comments, the room's tension deepened. Some attendees spoke in favor of inclusion, sharing personal stories of discrimination and resilience. Others defended the petition, their arguments thinly veiled with coded language about preserving the community. The discussions were passionate, sometimes heated, but Thomas and Eleanor worked to keep the tone respectful. One moment stood out above the rest. A young man named Marcus, who had grown up in the East Side apartments, stood to speak. His voice was hesitant at first, but it grew stronger as he shared his story of being followed by the police for no reason, of being told by a teacher that college wasn't for kids like him. "I'm not asking for special treatment," Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly. "I'm just asking to be treated like everyone else." "That's not too much to ask, is it?" The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone. Even those who had spoken in favor of the petition seemed unable to meet his eyes. As the forum ended, Thomas felt a flicker of hope. The meeting hadn't resolved everything, but it had started something. People were talking, listening, and questioning. The quiet resistance was growing louder. And for the first time, Thomas saw the faint outlines of a bridge across the divide. But he also knew the fight was far from over. The petition was still active, and the town's fractures wouldn't heal overnight. Yet, as he packed up the last of the chairs, Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder. "Tonight mattered," she said simply. Thomas nodded, his thoughts already turning to what came next. Tonight was just the beginning, and he was ready to keep building. One conversation, one action, one step at a time. The momentum from the community forum lingered in the air like the fading notes of a hymn. But it was fragile. Thomas Jenkins knew this as he leaned against the counter in his barber shop, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The conversation had begun, but it was now at a crossroads, and the weight of the town's divisions pressed harder against the seams. It started subtly, as things in Redford often did. Small changes that hinted at larger battles brewing beneath the surface. Flyers for the next community meeting were torn down from notice boards in the grocery store. Anonymous posts on social media spread fear-mongering rumors about the new families in the East Side apartments. Accusations of rising crime, property devaluation, and a decline in Redford's character. The most telling moment came one chilly morning when Thomas found a spray-painted slur on the window of his barbershop. His stomach clenched, but his anger simmered quietly. Instead of removing the graffiti immediately, he left it for the day. A stark reminder for his regulars of the ugliness simmering beneath their polite conversations. "Why do you leave that there?" asked Mr. Harris, an elderly customer who had been coming to Thomas for years. He shifted uncomfortably in the barber chair, his eyes darting to the window as if it burned his peripheral vision. "Because it's real," Thomas replied simply, "and pretending it's not there won't make it go away." Mr. Harris fell silent, his face tight with unease. Thomas didn't push. He let the weight of the words linger. Eleanor Reeves wasn't one to sit still, and Thomas found himself meeting her and a few others late into the night at the community center. They planned the next steps, organizing more events, reaching out to the press, and gathering signatures to counter the petition. But opposition was growing bolder. Flyers for their events were not just removed but replaced with ones promoting Redford Pride, a group that couched its agenda in innocuous language about preserving traditions and keeping Redford safe. The group's leader, a smooth-talking man named Richard Calloway, had become a frequent presence at city council meetings, his speeches dripping with coded rhetoric. "Calloway's dangerous," Eleanor said, her voice low as the group huddled over coffee and papers. "He knows how to sound reasonable while stirring up fear. We've got to be ready." Thomas nodded, though his mind churned with frustration. Calloway wasn't the kind of man who yelled or used slurs outright. He was the kind who wore his prejudice like a tailored suit. Clean, composed, and insidious. The tension came to a head on a Friday afternoon when Thomas decided to confront Calloway directly. The city council meeting was crowded, with people spilling into the hallways. Calloway stood at the podium, his voice calm but laced with urgency. "We're not against anyone," he said, gesturing to the crowd as if inviting their approval. "We just want what's best for Redford. Stability, safety, tradition. We can't let changes come at the cost of everything we've built." Thomas rose from his seat, his heart pounding but his resolve steady. "What exactly are we preserving, Mr. Calloway?" he asked, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Is it stability or exclusion? Safety or segregation?" Calloway turned, his smile cool but strained. "Mr. Jenkins, I respect your passion, but we can't ignore the facts. Changes like this, well, they don't come without consequences." "And what consequences are you talking about?" Thomas pressed, stepping closer to the podium. "Families trying to build a better life? Kids wanting to feel safe at school? Or is it just that they don't look like the families you're used to?" The room tensed, the air thick with the unsaid. Calloway hesitated, then smiled again, his voice soothing. "I think we all want the same thing, Mr. Jenkins, a town we can be proud of. We just have different ways of getting there." Thomas wanted to shout, to tear apart the veneer of civility Calloway used to mask his divisive agenda. But he didn't. Instead, he spoke with a quiet force. "Pride in Redford isn't about keeping people out. It's about making sure everyone feels like they belong. And if that's not what you're fighting for, then you're not fighting for this town." The aftermath of the meeting rippled through the community. Some praised Thomas's courage, while others whispered that he was stirring up trouble. His barbershop became a kind of battleground, customers bringing their opinions in alongside their requests for trims and shaves. "I'm with you, Thomas," one young man said, gripping his shoulder as he left. "I think you're pushing too hard." Another customer muttered later that afternoon, "You don't want to alienate folks." Thomas listened to them all, his patience tested but his determination unshaken. He knew the lines were being drawn, and he wasn't about to retreat. The fight wasn't just about a petition or a few hateful words on a window. It was about the soul of Redford, a fight for what kind of place it would become. That night, as Thomas walked home, the street seemed quieter than usual. The autumn leaves rustled in the breeze, and the faint glow of streetlights cast long shadows. He thought about Calloway's smirk, the whispered fears of neighbors, and the voices of kids like Marcus, who deserved so much more than a town divided against them. He stopped at the corner where the East Side apartments began, the lights in the windows glowing warmly against the night. Somewhere inside, families were settling down, their futures tied to a community that had yet to fully embrace them. Thomas clenched his fists, the weight of the struggle heavy but purposeful. Change was never easy, but it was necessary, and tomorrow, he will rise again, ready to push forward, because Redford wasn't just his home, it was his responsibility. The first cracks in Redford's facade of calm began to show early one morning, announced by the high-pitched wail of sirens echoing down Main Street. Thomas Jenkins stood outside his barber shop, the air around him tense and brittle as shards of glass from a shattered shop window crunched underfoot. The window belonged to the family-owned grocery store 2 doors down, a shop run by the Ramirezes, who had moved to Redford only a year ago. Thomas bent to pick up a shard, holding it in his hand as if examining a piece of the town's broken soul. He caught sight of Mrs. Ramirez inside, her eyes red and wide, her hands trembling as she swept the glass into a pile. "What happened?" Thomas asked softly. "They broke in," she whispered, her voice quivering. "Spray-painted things." She didn't need to say more. The words, "Go back where you came from," were scrawled in angry red letters across the back wall, a scar slashing through the shop's cheerful rows of canned goods and colorful piñatas. Thomas clenched his jaw. "Did anyone see who did it?" Mrs. Ramirez shook her head. "No, but we know." That night, the community gathered at the church. The forum was supposed to be a follow-up to the previous meeting, but it felt heavier now, the weight of the morning's events settling over everyone like a shroud. The room buzzed with tension, the lines between the two factions of Redford clearer than ever. Richard Calloway was there, seated in the front row with a small group of supporters, their posture stiff and watchful. On the opposite side of the room sat Eleanor Reeves and her coalition, their eyes burning with quiet determination. In the middle sat those caught in between, unsure of where they stood, but unable to look away from the rising tide. Thomas stood at the podium, his usual calm replaced by a simmering anger. "This morning, someone decided to send a message to the Ramirezes," he began, his voice steady but firm. "But what they don't understand is that their message speaks louder about who they are than who the Ramirezes are." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some nodding in agreement while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Calloway raised a hand, standing before Thomas could call on him. "Let's not jump to conclusions, Mr. Jenkins," he said smoothly. "We don't know who did this. And frankly, it's irresponsible to fan the flames of division by implying otherwise." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "You're right, Calloway. We don't know who did it. But I'll tell you this. Acts like this don't come from nowhere. They come from fear, from anger, and from people who think that tradition means shutting others out." Calloway smirked, his tone laced with condescension. "And what would you have us do, Thomas? Pretend that changes like these don't come with risks? We have a duty to protect our town." "Protect it from what?" Eleanor Reeves interjected, her voice sharp. "From families trying to make a living? From kids who just want a safe place to grow up?" The tension in the room rose like a pressure cooker. Voices overlapped, arguments spilling over as neighbors turned on one another. Thomas pounded his fist on the podium. "Enough," he shouted, silencing the room. "You all talk about Redford like it's yours to protect. But it doesn't belong to any one of us. It belongs to all of us. And if we keep tearing each other apart, there won't be anything left to protect." The meeting ended in chaos, with no resolution in sight. As Thomas locked up the barbershop that night, the shadows seemed darker than usual, the quiet more oppressive. He walked down the empty street, his footsteps echoing against the brick walls of buildings that now felt like silent witnesses to a town unraveling. The next morning, Thomas found a note slipped under the barbershop door. The words were simple but chilling: "Stay out of it." No signature, no explanation, just a warning. In the days that followed, the threats became more brazen. A brick was thrown through a window at the East Side apartments. A black teenager walking home from basketball practice was taunted by men in a pickup truck, their laughter echoing as they sped off. The stories multiplied, each one adding fuel to a fire that threatened to consume the town. Thomas began receiving late-night phone calls. Silent at first, just heavy breathing on the other end of the line. Then came the whispers, low and menacing. Watch yourself. He didn't tell anyone, not even Eleanor. He knew she'd worry, and he didn't want to add to the weight already pressing on her shoulders. But the fear settled in his chest. A cold, hard knot that refused to loosen. One evening, as Thomas sat in his living room, staring at the flyer for the next community meeting, his phone buzzed. It was Marcus, the teenager from the east side who had been harassed. "Mr. Jenkins," Marcus said, his voice shaky. "They're outside again. The same truck. They're just sitting there, watching." Thomas's heart raced. "Stay inside, Marcus. Lock the doors. I'll be right there." He grabbed his keys and drove across town, the knot in his chest tightening with every turn. When he arrived, the truck was gone, but Marcus stood on the porch, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "Why do they hate us?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas knelt to meet his eyes, the weight of the question heavy between them. "They're afraid, Marcus. They're afraid of losing something they think belongs to them. But that doesn't make it right." Marcus nodded slowly, but the fear in his eyes didn't fade. That night, as Thomas lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he realized the battle for Redford had reached a tipping point. The fear and hatred were no longer hidden. They were out in the open, daring anyone to challenge them. And Thomas knew he would, no matter the cost. Thomas awoke to the sound of his phone vibrating against the nightstand. The sky outside his bedroom window was still dark, the faint glow of dawn just beginning to seep through the cracks in the blinds. He reached for the phone, his heart sinking as he saw Eleanor's name flashing on the screen. "Thomas." Eleanor's voice was tight with urgency. "It's happened again. The Ramirez family's store. It's worse this time." Thomas sat up, the haze of sleep evaporating instantly. "Worse how?" "They set it on fire." "Thomas." "It's gone." By the time Thomas arrived at the scene, the sun was creeping over the horizon, casting a pale light on the smoldering remains of the small grocery store. The acrid smell of smoke hung heavy in the air, mixing with the scent of charred wood and melted plastic. A crowd had gathered, neighbors in pajamas, firefighters packing up hoses, and a few police officers milling about with grim expressions. Eleanor stood near the sidewalk, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched the Ramirez family huddled together. Mrs. Ramirez clung to her husband, their young daughter pressed against her side, tears streaking all their faces. Their dreams, their livelihood, had been reduced to ash. Thomas approached Eleanor, his fists clenched at his sides. "Did they catch who did it?" She shook her head. "Not yet, but they found a can of gasoline near the back door. This wasn't an accident." Thomas felt a wave of anger rise in his chest, hot and unrelenting. "This is escalating. Eleanor, we can't keep meeting and talking like nothing's happening. We need action." Eleanor turned to him, her eyes blazing. "What do you suggest, Thomas? A march? A protest? You've seen how divided this town is. If we push too hard, it could tear Redford apart." Thomas's jaw tightened. Maybe it needs to be torn apart before it can be put back together. Later that day, Thomas called an emergency meeting at the church. This time, the pews were packed, the tension in the room palpable. On one side sat Calloway and his supporters, their arms crossed and faces set with defiance. On the other side sat Eleanor, the Ramirez family, and others who had begun to speak out against the growing hostility. In the middle, as always, sat those who weren't sure where they belonged. Thomas stood at the front of the room, his voice steady but carrying an edge of frustration. "This town is on the brink of something we won't come back from. Last night, someone burned down a family's livelihood because of their last name, because of where they come from. And we all know it won't stop there." Calloway scoffed from his seat. "You're making it sound like there's a war in Redford. Thomas, it's one incident." "One incident?" Thomas repeated, his voice rising. "What about the threats? The broken windows? The slurs shouted from passing trucks? Or does it only count when someone ends up in a hospital bed?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Eleanor stood, her voice cutting through the noise. "This isn't about one incident. It's about a pattern, a sickness that's been allowed to fester because people like you." She pointed at Calloway. "Pretend it doesn't exist." Calloway stood as well, his face flushed. "I don't deny that things are tense. But you can't blame all of this on me. People are scared of change. It's natural." Eleanor shot back. "Fear doesn't justify hate. It doesn't justify violence." The meeting devolved into shouting. Neighbors yelling over one another. Old friendships fraying as years of unspoken resentment spilled into the open. Thomas banged a gavel on the podium, trying to regain control. "Enough," he shouted, his voice echoing in the rafters. "This isn't just about Redford anymore. It's about who we are as people. What kind of legacy we're leaving for our kids." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. Do we want them to grow up in a town where fear dictates who belongs and who doesn't? Or do we want them to learn that community means standing together, not tearing each other apart? That night, Thomas sat alone in his barber shop, the weight of the day pressing heavily on him. He thought of Marcus, of the Ramirez family, of the countless others who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. He thought of the threats that had landed at his doorstep, of the danger that came with speaking out. His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. It was a message from Eleanor. "You're right. It's time for action. Let's meet tomorrow to plan." Thomas exhaled slowly, the fire in his chest still burning. He knew the road ahead would be dangerous, that the forces working against them would not back down quietly. But as he looked around his shop, at the photographs on the wall and the sense of history embedded in the old barber chairs, he felt something else, a sense of purpose. Redford's story wasn't finished yet, and Thomas was determined to make sure it didn't end in ashes. The day of the march dawned gray and overcast, a heavy sky pressing down on the small town of Redford. Despite the weather, people gathered in the church parking lot, clutching handmade signs and wearing expressions of quiet determination. Thomas stood at the front of the group, his heart pounding as he looked out at the growing crowd. Eleanor stepped up beside him, her eyes scanning the faces of their neighbors, young and old, black and white, immigrants and lifelong residents. "We're ready," she said softly. Thomas nodded, gripping the megaphone in his hand. "Let's move." The march started peacefully, the rhythm of their footsteps echoing through the streets. People chanted slogans of unity and held signs reading, "Justice for all," "Hate has no home here," and "We belong together." The marchers stretched down the block, their voices growing louder as they neared the town square. But tension crackled in the air. Redford wasn't ready to confront itself. Not fully. As the marchers approached the square, a group of counter-protesters was waiting, their arms crossed and faces hard. Calloway stood at their center, his voice raised as he rallied them. "You're not going to tear this town apart," he shouted, his words sharp and defiant. Thomas raised the megaphone, his voice calm but resolute. "We're not here to tear anything apart. We're here to build something better." Calloway sneered. "You call this better? Stirring up trouble? Turning neighbor against neighbor?" Eleanor stepped forward, her voice cutting through the rising din. "The trouble was already here, Calloway. We're just refusing to ignore it anymore." For a moment, it seemed the two sides might find a fragile balance, an uneasy truce, but the peace was shattered when a rock sailed through the air, striking the edge of a marcher's sign. Gasps rippled through the crowd as both sides surged forward, shouting and pointing fingers. The police, who had been stationed at the edges of the square, stepped in to form a barrier, their presence only adding to the tension. Thomas felt a pang of fear but refused to let it show. He raised the megaphone again, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Stop, this isn't why we're here." The crowd hesitated, the shouting softening as people turned to look at him. Thomas climbed onto a bench, his heart hammering in his chest. "Look around you," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "We've spent too long letting fear and anger control us. But fear doesn't fix anything. Hate doesn't heal. If we want this town to survive, we have to face the truth. About ourselves and about each other." His words hung in the air, a fragile silence settling over the square. But it wasn't enough to hold back the undercurrent of hostility. A man from Calloway's group shouted, "Go back where you came from," and a marcher shot back, "We have as much right to be here as you." The tension snapped like a rubber band. The crowd surged again, pushing against the police barrier. Shouts turned to scuffles as people jostled each other, the line between protest and chaos blurring. In the middle of the chaos, Marcus appeared, his face pale but his eyes determined. "Thomas," he called, pushing through the crowd to reach him. "They're not listening." Thomas looked at the boy, his heart sinking. Marcus was right. The town wasn't ready to listen. Not yet. But then he saw something else. Mrs. Ramirez standing with her daughter, their hands tightly clasped as they tried to stay out of the fray. He saw Eleanor holding back tears as she argued with a man who refused to see her humanity. He saw the faces of his neighbors, twisted with anger, fear, and hurt, and he realized this moment wasn't about winning or losing. It was about planting a seed. Thomas climbed back onto the bench, raising the megaphone one last time. "If you hear nothing else today, hear this," he said, his voice cracking but clear. "Hate will never make this town stronger. Division will never make us safer. The only way forward is together." The crowd didn't fall silent this time. The tension didn't disappear, but a ripple passed through the square. A moment of hesitation, a flicker of possibility. As the marchers began to disperse, Thomas felt the weight of the day settle on his shoulders. He knew this was only the beginning. The march hadn't solved anything. Not yet, but it had started a conversation. And that was something. Eleanor approached him, her face tired but resolute. "We've got a long road ahead." Thomas nodded, looking out at the town he had called home his entire life. "Yeah," he said softly, "but at least we're finally walking it." And for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope.